They laughed right in my face at Sunday dinner and told me my career was nothing but a government handout. 3 days later, my father's billionaire boss walked into the executive boardroom, saw me sitting at the head of the mahogany table, and immediately snapped a terrified salute. The forks practically dropped from their hands when they realized the exact same woman they had just tried to extort was the military director holding their company's $500 million contract. I am Simone, 35 years old, and an active duty colonel in the United States Air Force, serving as the Director of Defense Acquisitions. Despite managing multi-billion-dollar budgets and commanding respect in the Pentagon, I somehow still find myself navigating the toxic and exhausting dynamics of my own family. Last Sunday, I decided to attend our traditional family dinner, hoping for a rare afternoon of peace. Instead, right between the collard greens and the cornbread, my brother-in-law slid a massive financial trap directly onto my plate. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to sit across a table from relatives who completely underestimated your intelligence and your worth. Growing up in our household meant constantly living in the shadow of my younger sister Jasmine. She was the undisputed golden child of the family. While I focused on strict academics and military service, Jasmine focused entirely on appearances and securing a lifestyle she could not actually afford. She recently married Trent, a white mid-level project manager at Vanguard Aerospace. Trent is a man who wears overly expensive suits to hide his profound insecurities and speaks entirely in aggressive corporate buzzwords. My parents, Richard and Brenda, absolutely worship him because he represents the wealthy corporate image they always desperately wanted for our family. They treat him like royalty while treating my military career like a temporary hobby I should have outgrown in my 20s. The dining room was filled with the rich, comforting smells of baked macaroni and cheese, roasted chicken, and sweet potato pie. I was quietly enjoying my meal, listening to Trent boast about his upcoming pitch at Vanguard Aerospace. He was loudly bragging to my father about how he was single-handedly going to secure a massive Department of Defense contract on Wednesday, which would supposedly guarantee him an immediate promotion to vice president. My father, a senior floor supervisor at the exact same aerospace company, nodded along with absolute reverence, hanging on to Trent's every single word. I kept my mouth shut and focused on my food. I had learned long ago that correcting Trent only led to exhausting arguments that my mother would inevitably blame me for starting. But then the conversation violently shifted in my direction. Without any warning, Trent reached into his designer leather briefcase, resting on the dining room floor. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers and carelessly slid them across the table. The heavy document glided right over my plate of macaroni and cheese, stopping inches from my chest. I looked down at the bold heading printed at the top. It was a formal loan application for $50,000. More specifically, it was a co-signer agreement demanding a second guarantor. I slowly looked up from the paper and met Trent's smug expression. He was leaning back in his dining chair, swirling a glass of red wine, like he was doing me a massive favor just by speaking to me. "Go ahead and sign that on the bottom line," Simone Trent said, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "Jasmine and I are upgrading our country club membership to the executive tier, and we are putting in a custom heated pool in the backyard. We need to entertain important corporate clients at the house if I'm going to be a vice president. Since my capital is currently tied up in aggressive stock portfolios, the bank just needs a secondary signature to clear the funds." I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his demand sink in. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked him why he thought I would ever sign a $50,000 loan for a vanity country club membership and a swimming pool. Jasmine rolled her eyes and crossed her arms, resting them heavily on the table. "Oh, please, Simone," she scoffed. "Do not act like you do not have the money, just hoarding it all to yourself." Trent leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table and attempting to physically intimidate me with his posture. "Look, Simone, You live in free military barracks. Your meals are paid for by the government. You do not have a mortgage or real expenses like adults in the corporate world do. You do not have to worry about property taxes or homeowner association fees. You have been riding the taxpayer dime for over a decade. It is time you actually contributed to the family and helped elevate our social standing. Consider it your duty since your government handout job does not bring any real prestige to this family. The silence in the room was deafening. My mother Brenda and my father Richard did not say a single word to defend me. They just looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to submit to Trent's ridiculous demands just like they always did. They actually believed his assumption that a high-ranking officer in the United States Air Force lived in a shared concrete dormitory and ate military rations in a crowded cafeteria. The truth was, I owned a sprawling 4-bedroom home in a beautiful gated community. I drove a luxury vehicle and managed a personal investment portfolio that easily eclipsed Trent's entire net worth. But I stopped updating my family on my life achievements years ago. Sharing my success with them never brought joy, it only ever brought bitter jealousy or aggressive requests for cash. My heart beat steadily in my chest. Years of rigorous military discipline kept my face entirely neutral. I did not scream. I did not throw my glass of water in his face. I calmly reached into my purse and pulled out a heavy red fountain pen. I clicked the cap off and pulled the loan document closer to me. Trent's smug smile widened into a full grin. He looked over at my father, giving him a victorious nod, assuming I had caved to his aggressive negotiation tactics. I skimmed the financial breakdown on the second page of the application. My eyes immediately caught the amortization schedule Trent had prepared to justify his ability to pay the bank back. It was painfully flawed. I took my red pen and drew a thick, aggressive circle around his compound interest calculations. I crossed out his projected monthly payments and quickly scribbled the correct actual mathematical figures in the margins. The bank would have rejected this application instantly based on his terrible math alone. I placed the cap back on my pen with a sharp click. I slid the document back across the table. It stopped directly in front of Trent's wine glass. I do not finance bad investments, Trent. I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely deadpan. And if you are going to try and extort $50,000 from me, you should probably learn how to calculate an annual percentage rate properly. Your numbers are off by thousands. Trent's face flushed a deep, angry shade of crimson. The arrogant smugness vanished instantly, replaced by sheer indignation. He snatched the paper off the table, staring at the bright red ink bleeding through his pristine application. Jasmine gasped, deeply offended that I had dared to correct her husband in front of our parents. The air in the dining room grew incredibly thick. The casual Sunday dinner had officially transformed into a battlefield, and I was firmly holding my ground. The sharp sound of crystal slamming against heavy mahogany echoed through the room. My mother Brenda had brought her iced tea glass down with such force that the amber liquid sloshed over the rim and soaked into the pristine white tablecloth. She was glaring at me with a look of pure, unfiltered disgust, the kind of look a mother should never give her own daughter. "How dare you speak to him that way?" She snapped, her voice trembling with that familiar, misplaced, righteous anger. "You have always been so incredibly selfish, Simone. You sit there with your smug little face thinking you are better than us just because you wear a uniform and give orders to grunts. Trent is family. He is the man of his household. He is trying to build a future for your sister, and you humiliate him over a few misplaced numbers." I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. "A few misplaced numbers," I repeated calmly. "Mom, those misplaced numbers would legally bind me to a $50,000 debt with an interest rate that would bankrupt a small business. Trent is asking me to risk my financial security so he can swim in a heated pool and play golf with corporate executives. That is not family loyalty. That is financial abuse." "Do not you dare use those therapy words with me," Brenda shouted, pointing a manicured finger across the table. You know nothing about loyalty. You have never cared about anyone but yourself. You have always been jealous of Jasmine, and you have spent your entire life trying to sabotage her happiness." The accusation was so wildly absurd that I almost laughed, but the heavy knot of betrayal in my chest kept me grounded. Jealous of Jasmine, the golden child, who had never worked a single day of hard labor in her entire life. "You are doing it again, Simone," my mother continued, her voice rising in pitch. "Just like you did when you were 18. Do you remember that? Do you remember when Jasmine got accepted into that prestigious private design school in New York? We asked you to do one simple thing for your family. We asked you to transfer your college savings to her account because her tuition was higher than yours. You were just going to a state school anyway. But no, you refused. You let your own sister struggle while you hoarded your money. You forced her to drop out after 2 semesters because she could not afford the materials." I stared at my mother, letting the sheer revisionist history wash over me. The college savings she was referring to was not a gift from our parents. It was a fund I had built myself by working double shifts at a diner every weekend since I was 15 years old, while simultaneously maintaining a perfect 4.0 grade point average. Jasmine had wanted to study fashion design in Manhattan. She wanted a luxury apartment and an allowance. When my parents realized they could not afford to fund Jasmine's lavish lifestyle, they demanded I hand over every single dollar I had earned scrubbing grease off diner floors. When I said no and enlisted in the military to guarantee my own education, they painted me as the villain. They had carried that delusional grudge for nearly 2 decades. "I did not force Jasmine to do anything, Mom," I replied, my voice steady and measured. "I paid for my own education, and Jasmine was entirely capable of doing the same." Right on cue, Jasmine deployed her greatest weapon. She let out a soft, pathetic whimper and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook as she forced out a series of theatrical sobs. "Oh, Mom, please stop!" Jasmine cried, peering through her fingers to make sure everyone was watching her performance. "It is fine. I am used to Simone treating me like garbage. I just wanted us to be close. I just wanted my big sister to support me for once in her life, but she always ruins everything. She hates me, Mom. She has always hated me." Trent immediately wrapped his arm around Jasmine's shoulders, pulling her close and pressing a kiss to her temple. "Shh, baby. It is okay," he whispered loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "We do not need her money. We do not need her toxic energy in our lives. I will take care of you. I always do." The performance was nauseating. Trent was literally sitting there comforting his wife about not getting my money, while simultaneously holding a rejected loan application that proved he desperately needed my money. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. My mother rushed over from her side of the table, wrapping her arms around Jasmine's chair and glaring at me like I had just committed a violent crime. "Look what you did," Brenda hissed. "You come into our home, eat our food, and make your sister cry. You are bitter, Simone. You are a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand to see a successful, happy couple. You should be down on your knees thanking Trent for even inviting you to be part of his business ventures. He is offering you a chance to be attached to real wealth, and you spit in his face." I took a slow, deep breath, refusing to let them see how much their coordinated attacks still stung. Even at 35 years old, standing as a decorated officer who commanded thousands of personnel, a small part of me still felt like that exhausted teenager begging for just a fraction of the love they poured so effortlessly into Jasmine. But I quickly buried that vulnerability. The woman sitting at this table was not a victim anymore. She was a colonel. And colonels do not bleed for people who hold the knife. I looked away from my mother and shifted my gaze to my father. Richard had been entirely silent through this entire exchange. He was sitting at the head of the table, methodically chewing a piece of roasted chicken. He had always been the quiet enforcer of the house, letting my mother do the screaming while he delivered the final crushing blows. I waited for him to speak, hoping against all logic that just this once he might actually look at the facts. He might actually see that his son-in-law was trying to scam his eldest daughter. Instead, my father swallowed his food, wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, and picked up his fork. The metal tines were slick with grease from the chicken. He raised his hand and pointed that greasy fork directly at the center of my chest. His eyes were cold and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "You need to check your attitude, young lady," my father said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that demanded absolute obedience. "Your mother is right. You walk in here with your military boots acting like you run the world. You do not run anything. You take orders from politicians and you live on government welfare disguised as a salary." He lowered the fork and pointed it toward Trent, who was sitting up straighter now, practically glowing under my father's defense. "Trent is a corporate leader," my father continued, his chest puffing out with borrowed pride. "He is managing millions of dollars in private sector capital. He is about to secure a contract that will put him in the executive suite of Vanguard Aerospace. You know who I am, Simone? I am a senior supervisor on that manufacturing floor. I know how the real world operates. I know who holds the real power, and it is men like Trent." He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table. "Instead of sitting there correcting a man's paperwork and disrespecting him under my roof, you should be asking for his help. With your dead-end government job, you should be begging Trent for a position at Vanguard Aerospace. You should be asking him to pull some strings so you can finally make real money and amount to something in this life." The sheer irony of his statement hung in the air, wrapping around me like a thick iron chain. My father was looking at a man who was begging me for $50,000 and telling me I should be begging that exact same man for a job. The delusion was absolute. They had built a massive, glittering pedestal for Trent, and nothing, not even basic arithmetic, was going to knock him off it. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother coddling my sister. And finally, I looked at Trent, who was wearing a triumphant, sickening smirk. They had no idea who I was. They had no idea what I did. And more importantly, they had absolutely no idea who was going to be sitting on the other side of that boardroom table on Wednesday morning. My father leaned back in his chair, letting out a harsh, barking laugh that seemed to echo off the dining room walls. "You look at us like you are some kind of high-powered executive, Simone," he sneered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Let us be brutally honest here. You wear a uniform, but you are basically just a glorified DMV worker in camo. You sit behind a metal desk, you stamp government forms, and you wait for a pension. You have absolutely no idea how real corporate money works. You have never had to survive in the private sector, where actual stakes are on the line." The entire table erupted into laughter. Jasmine giggled, hiding her mouth behind her hand like a schoolgirl, while my mother offered a tight, satisfied smirk. Trent actually slapped his knee, leaning back as if my father had just delivered the punchline to the greatest joke of the century. The sound of their shared amusement was thick and suffocating, but I let them laugh. I did not defend my rank. I did not explain that my signature moved billions of dollars across international borders. I just sat perfectly still, letting them dig their own graves with their staggering ignorance. Trent wiped a fake tear from his eye and cleared his throat, eager to reclaim the spotlight. "Richard is exactly right," he said, his voice brimming with unchecked arrogance. "The military is just a slow, bloated bureaucracy. They do not understand innovation. They just throw taxpayer money at guys like me to solve their problems. That is exactly why Wednesday is going to change everything for this family." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, speaking with the hushed intensity of a man revealing a profound secret. "On Wednesday morning, I am leading a massive presentation for a $500 million Department of Defense contract. Vanguard Aerospace is pitching a next-generation navigation system, and I am the point man. When I close this deal, and I will close it, CEO. Sterling has practically guaranteed me a spot in the executive suite. Vice President of Vanguard Aerospace before my 35th birthday." My father beamed with pride, practically vibrating in his seat. "See that, Simone?" he pointed out triumphantly. "That is what real ambition looks like. That is what it means to be a provider." Trent took a slow sip of his wine, savoring his own perceived brilliance. "The military brass coming to review the pitch are just pencil pushers," he continued, waving his hand dismissively. "They just want to see some flashy PowerPoint slides and hear some confident projections. I have the entire committee wrapped around my finger. Once I get that promotion, $50,000 for a pool is going to look like absolute pocket change. But since I need the cash liquid right now, I am giving you the opportunity to be useful. So stop playing games and sign the paper. I did not answer him right away. My gaze had drifted past Trent's shoulder toward the granite kitchen counter directly behind him. He had carelessly left his open leather briefcase resting near the coffee maker. Sticking out of the side pocket was a thick manila folder packed with documents. From where I was sitting, the bold alphanumeric string printed on the top tab was clearly visible. Project Vanguard Nexus Echo 7. My breath caught slightly in my throat, but my face remained an unreadable mask. I knew that alphanumeric string. I had stared at that exact same sequence of letters and numbers for the past 3 weeks inside a secure briefing room at the Pentagon. It was the classified project code for the aerospace contract my Defense Acquisitions Committee was currently auditing. The pieces fell together with terrifying clarity. Trent was not just presenting to any military committee on Wednesday. He was presenting to my committee. He was pitching a $500 million contract to the exact same woman he was currently trying to extort for pool money. He thought he was walking into a room full of gullible pencil pushers, but he was actually walking straight into a slaughterhouse. And I was the one holding the axe. I looked back at Trent. He was staring at me, waiting for me to break under his psychological pressure, waiting for me to reach for the pen and submit to his authority. Instead, the corners of my mouth slowly turned upward. I smiled. It was not a warm smile, and it certainly was not a friendly one. It was the calm, calculating smile of a predator watching its prey wander blindly into a perfectly laid trap. "You know what, Trent?" I said, my voice softer now, completely stripped of any previous tension. "You make a very compelling argument. You clearly have everything figured out. Your future, your numbers, your highly anticipated presentation on Wednesday. It sounds like you are on the verge of a massive career breakthrough." Trent puffed his chest out, taking my words as a complete surrender. "Exactly," he said confidently. "So let us stop wasting time. Sign the paperwork and we can all go back to enjoying this beautiful Sunday dinner." I picked up the red pen again. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, and my father nodded approvingly, crossing his arms over his chest. Jasmine practically bounced in her seat, already mentally spending the money on patio furniture. I pulled the loan application toward me, uncapped the pen, and pressed the bright red ink against the signature line at the bottom of the page. But I did not write my name. Instead, I wrote 3 massive capitalized letters across the entire signature block. I spelled out the word "no," and I underlined it twice, tearing the paper slightly with the force of the pen. I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, shattering the brief moment of peace they thought they had secured. "What are you doing?" My mother demanded, her relief instantly vaporizing into panic. "I am leaving," I replied calmly, sliding the ruined document back across the table one final time. "I told you I do not finance bad investments. And Trent, based on everything you just told me about your upcoming pitch, I think you are the worst investment sitting at this table." The smugness vanished from Trent's face, replaced by an ugly, twisting rage. He slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the plates. "You are making a massive mistake, Simone," he barked, his voice losing all its polished corporate charm. "No, I am not," I replied smoothly, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. "But you might want to double-check those flashy PowerPoint slides you mentioned. I hear the military brass can be surprisingly strict about sloppy math." The moment those words left my mouth, Jasmine erupted. She slammed both of her hands flat against the table with such violent force that her wineglass tipped over, spilling dark red liquid across the white linen tablecloth. Her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage, shedding the fake tears and the delicate victim act entirely. "You are such a jealous, bitter loser, Simone," she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly through the dining room. "Trent is offering you a chance to be part of something huge, and you are sitting here making snide comments about his math. You do not know anything about his job. You do not know anything about success." Jasmine marched around the table, stepping right into my personal space. She pointed her manicured finger directly in my face, her eyes wide with fury. "You are going to pick up that pen right now," she demanded, her chest heaving with indignation. "You are going to sign that loan document, and you are going to apologize to my husband for disrespecting him in front of our parents. This pool renovation is critical for our social standing in the neighborhood, and I will not let your petty jealousy ruin it. If you do not sign it, you can walk right out that front door and never speak to us again. You are just mad that I have a successful man who provides a luxury lifestyle for me while you have absolutely nobody." Before I could even respond to her ridiculous ultimatum, Trent decided he needed to reclaim his dominance. He kicked his chair back so hard it crashed against the antique china cabinet behind him, rattling the porcelain plates. He stomped over to where Jasmine and I were standing, puffing his chest out and trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. His face was blotchy and red, his polished corporate veneer completely stripped away by his heavily bruised ego. "You think you are so smart because you caught a minor clerical error on a piece of paper?" Trent spat, crossing his arms and glaring down at me. "You think that gives you the right to question my professional competence? Let me explain something to you, Simone, since you clearly do not understand how the real world operates outside of your little military bubble. The project I am pitching on Wednesday is not some basic government requisition form. We are building state-of-the-art next-generation aerospace defense grids." Trent took another aggressive step forward, invading my space just like my sister. I stood perfectly still, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me retreat. "We are dealing with quantum navigation algorithms, complex satellite telemetry, and highly encrypted military frequencies," Trent boasted, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "This is highly classified advanced engineering. It is the kind of complex aerospace technology that your little public servant brain could not even begin to comprehend. You stamp papers for a living and wait for a taxpayer-funded pension. I am building the future of national security." I listened to his arrogant rant with absolute fascination. It was incredible to watch a man speak with such supreme confidence about a subject he barely understood. Trent was a mid-level project manager, not an aerospace engineer. He organized meetings, tracked budgets, and sent endless chain emails. Yet here he was, loudly lecturing a decorated Air Force colonel about the intricacies of military satellite telemetry. The very same telemetry protocols that I had personally helped draft and authorize at the Pentagon 3 years ago. Trent mistook my silence for submission. He thought his barrage of big words had successfully put me in my place. He sneered at me, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive designer shirt. "When I walk into that boardroom on Wednesday, I am going to blow those military bureaucrats away," he continued, his voice rising with manic certainty. "Those generals and committee members are just out-of-touch pencil pushers. They do not understand private sector innovation. I am going to secure a $500 million contract, and CEO Sterling is going to hand me the keys to the executive suite. I will be a vice president. I will be making more money in one single fiscal quarter than you make in an entire decade of your miserable government service." He looked over at Jasmine, who was staring up at him with absolute adoration, clearly intoxicated by his promises of massive wealth. Then he turned his cold, arrogant eyes back to me. "And once I get that promotion, I want you to understand something very clearly," Trent said, lowering his voice into a harsh, threatening growl. "You are permanently banned from our lives. I do not want to see your broke face at my house ever again. You are not welcome at our new pool. You are not welcome at our country club dinners. When you are still sitting in a cramped military office 10 years from now wondering why your life went nowhere, do not come crawling to us for financial help, because the door will be slammed right in your face." My mother and father watched this entire aggressive display from the dining table. They did not intervene. They did not tell Trent to step back or ask him to lower his voice. They simply watched their son-in-law verbally abuse and threaten their eldest daughter, and they nodded in silent agreement. They had chosen their side. They had firmly placed all of their chips on Trent's impending promotion, and they viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle in his path. The threat of being banned from Jasmine's vanity projects and Trent's imaginary mansion was supposed to devastate me. It was supposed to be the ultimate punishment, breaking my spirit and forcing me to beg for their forgiveness and inclusion. But as I stood there listening to the echoes of Trent's yelling fade into the dining room, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of clarity. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his chaotic energy. I simply reached forward and calmly began to button my military-issued dress coat. I aligned the brass buttons with slow, deliberate precision, completely unbothered by the hostility radiating from the two people standing mere inches from my face. My heart rate had not elevated a single beat. After surviving intense military deployments and facing down ruthless foreign defense contractors, a shouting match with an insecure corporate middle manager was completely insignificant. I smoothed out the heavy fabric of my coat lapels and looked Trent directly in his eyes. The sheer emptiness of his threat was almost comical. He was banning me from his home based on the absolute assumption of a promotion that I was personally going to destroy in exactly 72 hours. He had just openly insulted the intelligence of the exact woman who held his entire professional future in the palm of her hand. As I turned on my heel and took my first step toward the front hallway, the reality of the situation finally pierced through my parents' collective delusion. The $50,000 golden ticket they had practically guaranteed their favorite son-in-law was calmly walking right out their front door. I heard the sudden sharp screech of wooden dining chairs being violently pushed back against the hardwood floor. "Simone, do not you dare walk out that door!" My mother shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the foyer. I kept walking my polished uniform shoes, clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. But before I could reach the brass handle of the front door, my mother sprinted past me. She physically threw herself in front of the heavy oak door, spreading her arms out wide to block my exit. Her chest was heaving and her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate energy. She was no longer playing the role of the refined suburban matriarch. She was fully panicking. "If you walk out of this house without signing that paper, you are completely done." My mother threatened, her voice vibrating with absolute hysteria. "Do you hear me, Simone? If you turn your back on your sister today, I will personally make sure you are cut out of this family forever. You will not be invited to Thanksgiving dinner. You will not come over for Christmas morning. You can spend the holidays sitting all alone in your miserable military barracks because you will be dead to us." I stopped a few feet away from her, looking at the woman who gave birth to me. It was genuinely astounding to witness how quickly she was willing to discard her eldest daughter over a swimming pool and a country club membership. She was using the holidays as a weapon, assuming that the threat of isolation would break my resolve. She assumed I desperately craved a seat at a table where I was constantly served disrespect. Before I could tell her exactly how little I cared about missing her dry turkey and passive-aggressive holiday comments, my father stomped into the hallway. Richard moved with a heavy, intimidating presence, stepping right up next to my mother to form a physical barricade between me and the exit. His face was set in a deep, furious scowl, the kind of look that used to terrify me when I was a little girl. But I was not a little girl anymore. "You are not going anywhere until you fix this," my father commanded, pointing a thick, rigid finger directly at my face. "You are going to turn around, march right back into that dining room, and apologize to Trent. You are going to beg for his forgiveness, and then you are going to sign that document. I will not tolerate this kind of blatant disrespect under my roof." I looked at my father, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with my disgust. "I am not apologizing to a man who just tried to scam me out of $50,000, Dad," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional reaction. "And I am certainly not apologizing to a man who just screamed in my face while you sat there and watched." My father stepped closer, aggressively invading my personal space in a pathetic attempt to assert his dominance. "You owe him that apology," he barked, his face turning red with exertion. "Trent is a corporate executive. He is going to be the vice president of Vanguard Aerospace. He is actively trying to elevate the status of this entire family, and you are letting your bitter jealousy ruin everything. This is about family loyalty, Simone, something you clearly know absolutely nothing about." Family loyalty, my mother chimed in, nodding vigorously as she kept her back pressed against the front door. We raised you to support your own blood. We sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us. By trying to destroy your sister's happiness just because no successful man has ever wanted you. You are a spiteful, ungrateful daughter. They were cornering me, teaming up to deliver the ultimate emotional blackmail. It was a classic tactic they had used for decades whenever they needed to force me into compliance. They would attack my character, attack my relationship status, and demand absolute blind loyalty to a family structure that only ever benefited Jasmine. They truly believed that if they yelled loud enough and threatened me with total isolation, I would eventually crack drop to my knees and hand over my hard-earned money just to buy back their conditional love. But the emotional manipulation simply bounced off me like bullets hitting thick titanium armor. I had spent the last 15 years of my life leading men and women in high-stakes combat zones. I had negotiated massive defense contracts with ruthless international weapons manufacturers who would not hesitate to destroy a career for a fraction of a percent in profit. The loud, desperate threats of two enablers in a suburban hallway did not even register on my threat assessment scale. I stood perfectly tall, my shoulders squared and my posture impeccable. I looked at my mother, who was still aggressively blocking the door, and then I shifted my gaze to my father, who was glaring at me with unchecked hostility. They were betting their entire future on Trent. They were burning their relationship with me to the ground in order to protect a man whose entire corporate existence I was scheduled to terminate in exactly 3 days. I slowly reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out my car keys. The metallic jingle cut through the tense, heavy silence in the foyer. I understand exactly what family loyalty is, Dad, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, authoritative register that commanded absolute silence. Loyalty is protecting the people you love from bad decisions. But you are not protecting anyone. You are just submitting to a man because he wears a fancy suit and throws around corporate buzzwords. You are demanding my loyalty while actively facilitating my financial ruin. My father opened his mouth to shout another command, but I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I did not break eye contact. My gaze was piercing, unwavering, and completely devoid of fear. Loyalty goes both ways, Dad, I said softly but firmly, delivering the words with the precision of a scalpel. You are backing the wrong horse. And when he inevitably collapses, do not expect me to clean up the mess. I did not wait for his response. I simply reached out, firmly grasped my mother's shoulder, and moved her out of my way with minimal physical effort. She gasped in shock, stumbling slightly to the side as I reached for the brass handle, pulled the heavy oak door open, and stepped out into the crisp Sunday afternoon air. The crisp Sunday afternoon air hit my face the moment I crossed the threshold, pulling the suffocating tension of that house out of my lungs. I walked across the wide concrete porch, my posture perfectly straight, and my mind completely clear. Behind me, I heard the heavy footsteps of someone refusing to let the situation end gracefully. Trent had followed me outside. His fragile ego simply could not handle the fact that a woman he viewed as utterly beneath him was walking away from his demands without shedding a single tear or begging for his approval. He pushed the screen door open so hard it slammed against the brick exterior of the house. He marched right to the edge of the top step, leaning over the wooden railing like a king shouting down at a peasant from his castle wall. Jasmine and my parents quickly crowded into the doorway behind him, forming a bizarre little audience for his final pathetic performance. You are going to regret this, Simone. Trent shouted, his voice echoing down the quiet, manicured suburban street. People walking their dogs on the opposite sidewalk actually stopped and turned to look, but Trent was entirely too consumed by his own arrogance to care about causing a public scene. You think you are so independent because you have a little government pension waiting for you? He sneered, waving his hand dismissively in my direction. But you have absolutely no idea how fast the real world moves. When I am sitting in the executive suite of Vanguard Aerospace making decisions that actually matter, you are still going to be taking orders and wearing the exact same cheap uniform. So when you finally realize you threw away your only connection to real wealth, do not come crying to me when you are still completely broke at 40. I had already reached the end of the walkway, but his words made me stop. I stood perfectly still on the pristine pavement. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the large oak tree in my parents' front yard. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute absurdity of his threat. I did not feel angry. I did not feel insulted. I felt a profound, almost euphoric sense of anticipation. I turned around slowly, pivoting on my heel to face him one last time. I looked past my mother, who was glaring at me with bitter resentment. I looked past my father, who was shaking his head in silent disappointment. I locked my eyes directly onto Trent's flushed, arrogant face. I made sure my expression was completely devoid of any emotion. I was not the bitter, jealous sister they desperately wanted me to be. I was the director of defense acquisitions, and I was looking at a man whose career I was about to systematically dismantle. "I will not be at your house, Trent," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the front lawn, sharp and cold as ice. "You never have to worry about me knocking on your door or asking for a single dime of your money. But I will definitely see you on Wednesday morning." Trent's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. His aggressive posture faltered for a fraction of a second as his brain tried to process why I was bringing up the specific day of his massive corporate presentation. And Trent, I continued holding his gaze until I saw a tiny flicker of uncertainty finally register in his eyes. "When I do see you on Wednesday, you need to make sure your math is significantly better than it was on that loan application. Because the people reviewing your project do not tolerate sloppy numbers." I did not wait for him to respond. I did not give him the opportunity to shout another insult or demand an explanation. I simply turned my back on him and walked toward my vehicle parked along the curb. My parents and Trent had always assumed I drove some beat-up old sedan or relied on a military transport bus because that fit their carefully constructed narrative of my miserable, broke existence. They had never actually bothered to look at the car I arrived in. I clicked the unlock button on my key fob, and the headlights of my sleek custom black Audi RS7 flashed in the afternoon sun. The car cost more than Trent's entire annual salary. I opened the heavy door, slid into the premium leather driver's seat, and pressed the ignition button. The twin-turbo engine roared to life with a deep, powerful growl that completely drowned out whatever panicked question Trent was currently asking my father on the porch. I shifted the car into drive and glanced at the rearview mirror. The visual was absolutely priceless. The aggressive, confident stance Trent had displayed just moments ago was entirely gone. He was standing on the edge of the porch, staring at the back of my luxury vehicle with his mouth slightly open. Jasmine was frantically pulling at his arm, pointing at my car, and clearly demanding to know how her supposedly destitute sister was driving a $150,000 machine. My father had stepped out onto the porch, looking back and forth between Trent and my departing car, his face pale with the sudden creeping realization that he might have severely miscalculated the entire situation. They were angry, but more importantly, they were finally confused. The seed of doubt had been planted deep in their minds. For the first time in their lives, they were being forced to question the rigid hierarchy they had built. They were wondering what I meant about Wednesday. They were wondering how I could afford that car. They were wondering if the quiet military sister they had spent years mocking was actually hiding a level of power they could not even begin to comprehend. I pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the neighborhood traffic. I did not look back again. The toxic Sunday dinner was officially over. I turned on the radio, letting the smooth rhythm of a jazz station fill the quiet cabin of my car. The drive back to my own home was incredibly peaceful. As I left the manicured limits of my parents' affluent neighborhood and headed toward my own gated community, the heavy knot of tension that always accompanied family gatherings completely dissolved. I pulled into my spacious driveway and parked next to my meticulously landscaped front yard. My home was quiet, stable, and entirely mine. There were no golden children here. There were no corporate egos demanding my submission. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a life built on discipline, hard work, and absolute independence. I walked through my front door, hung my keys on the hook, and immediately walked into my home office. I opened my secure briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder labeled Project Vanguard Nexus Echo 7. I spread the schematics and financial projections across my large mahogany desk. Trent had called the military brass out of touch pencil pushers. He had laughed at the uniform I wore with pride. He had threatened to ban me from a family I no longer wanted to be part of. I picked up a fresh red pen from my desk drawer. I spent the rest of the evening carefully reviewing every single line of his $500 million proposal. I found the padded budgets. I found the glaring safety flaws in the satellite telemetry. I found the stolen tech designs he tried to pass off as vanguard innovations. I circled every single lie with bright red ink. Wednesday was going to be a very long day for the future vice president of Vanguard Aerospace. Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp, cool efficiency of a perfectly executed military operation. At exactly 0800 hours, my three-car government motorcade pulled onto the pristine corporate campus of Vanguard Aerospace. I sat quietly in the back of the lead armored sport utility vehicle, dressed in my immaculate Class A uniform. The silver eagles on my shoulders gleamed, catching the morning light as we bypassed the crowded employee parking lots and headed straight for the restricted executive entrance. As my driver navigated the circular driveway, I looked out through the heavy tinted windows. Vanguard headquarters was an imposing structure made almost entirely of steel and sheer glass. Because of the transparent architecture, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the massive main lobby from the comfort of my back seat. It was a bustling hive of morning corporate activity, but my eyes immediately locked onto two very familiar figures standing near the private executive elevators. Trent was holding court right in the center of the atrium. He was wearing a ridiculously flashy tailored three-piece suit that looked like it belonged in a fashion magazine rather than a serious defense contractor meeting. Even through the thick glass, I could tell he was speaking at an obnoxious volume. He was surrounded by a small group of young receptionists and junior project analysts who were nodding along politely to whatever arrogant speech he was delivering. Trent was aggressively waving a cup of artisan coffee in one hand and gesturing wildly with the other, treating his upcoming presentation like it was merely a victory lap. He was clearly bragging about his impending promotion to vice president. He carried himself with the bloated, unearned confidence of a man who believed the entire Department of Defense review was just a minor bureaucratic hurdle, a simple formality he could easily charm his way through. He laughed loudly, tossing his head back, completely oblivious to the reality that his $500 million proposal currently sat inside my locked briefcase, thoroughly covered in my red ink. Just a few feet away from Trent, my father Richard was putting on his own embarrassing display. He was dressed in his standard blue floor supervisor uniform, standing in a circle with three of his fellow manufacturing managers. My father had a massive, proud smile plastered across his face. He kept pointing his thumb over at Trent, hyping up his son-in-law to his buddies. He was soaking up the borrowed prestige, acting as if Trent's imaginary success was his own personal achievement. I watched my father pat one of his coworkers on the back, likely boasting about how his brilliant son-in-law was about to secure the financial future of the entire aerospace company. I sat in the quiet sanctuary of the armored vehicle, watching them revel in their absolute ignorance. Trent truly believed that throwing around corporate buzzwords made him invincible. He had built his entire identity around the illusion of corporate supremacy. My father had bought into that illusion, completely willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood just to stay close to the artificial warmth of Trent's perceived wealth. They had both forgotten the fundamental rule of authority. Real power does not need to brag to receptionists in a corporate lobby. Real power arrives quietly, commands the room, and dictates the terms of survival. It was a fascinating psychological display. Just 3 days prior, these exact same men had sat at a dining room table and called me a glorified government worker. They had laughed in my face, demanded I empty my savings to fund their luxury pool, and told me I would be completely broke at 40 because I could not possibly understand the complex realities of private sector money. Now here they were standing in the lobby of their corporate temple, worshipping an executive hierarchy that they fundamentally did not understand. While Trent and my father were busy inflating their egos inside the lobby, the actual reality of the situation was unfolding outside on the front pavement. Mr. Sterling, the billionaire chief executive officer of Vanguard Aerospace, was not inside celebrating. He was standing on the curb directly in front of my motorcade, sweating profusely despite the cool morning air. He was flanked by his senior legal counsel and his chief financial officer, all of them looking incredibly nervous. They understood the gravity of this audit. They knew that the military committee arriving this morning held the power to either save their quarterly earnings or bankrupt their entire division. My vehicle smoothly came to a halt right in front of the red carpet that Mr. Sterling had ordered rolled out for us. The sudden arrival of the black government vehicles immediately caught the attention of the building security team. I watched the head security guard tap his earpiece, his eyes widening as he recognized the federal license plates and the official military seals on the doors of our transport. Panic rippled through the security desk. Inside the lobby, Trent was still laughing, totally oblivious to the heavy machinery of consequence pulling up right outside his glass walls. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute calm that always settled over me right before a major engagement. I picked up my leather briefcase, straightened my lapels, and gave my driver a short nod. The driver stepped out and quickly opened my door. As my polished black shoes hit the pavement, Mr. Sterling immediately rushed forward, his face pale with corporate anxiety. The military entourage from the trailing vehicles quickly formed up behind me. 2 Air Force captains and a major, all carrying thick binders of classified material, flanked me as we approached the entrance. The sheer visual impact of a high-ranking military delegation moving in perfect unison was undeniable. At that exact same moment, the security guards inside the lobby scrambled out from behind their massive marble desk, physically pushing junior employees out of the way to clear a broad path. Inside the atrium, the casual coffee conversations abruptly died. The clicking of keyboards and the ringing of phones seemed to completely stop as people turned to stare. The heavy automatic glass doors of Vanguard Aerospace slid open wide with a soft mechanical hiss. The bustling noise of the corporate lobby was instantly sucked out into the morning air, and a sudden, heavy, absolute hush fell over the entire building as the security guards snapped to rigid attention. The heavy automatic glass doors remained wide open, letting the cool morning breeze sweep into the sterile corporate environment. Mr. Sterling, the billionaire chief executive officer, backed into his own lobby, looking absolutely terrified. He was practically sprinting backward across the highly polished marble floor, swiping a silk handkerchief across his sweating forehead. For a man who regularly intimidated Wall Street bankers and completely dominated corporate negotiations, Sterling looked like a nervous intern desperately trying to appease a group of very dangerous investors. He bowed his head slightly, gesturing frantically toward the private executive elevators completely out of his element. Trent stood a few yards away, his eyes lighting up with opportunistic greed. He saw his CEO sweating profusely, and immediately recognized that the Pentagon Review Board had finally arrived. This was his moment. This was the exact scenario he had been boasting about all morning to anyone who would listen. He quickly shoved his artisan coffee into the hands of a junior receptionist without even looking at her. He shot his cuffs, straightened his expensive silk tie, and flashed his perfectly practiced corporate smile. He turned to his small audience of junior analysts and quietly told them to pay very close attention because they were about to witness exactly how a future vice president controls a room full of military brass. From the center of the sliding glass doors, the military entourage finally made their entrance. The sharp, rhythmic sound of their polished leather shoes striking the marble floor echoed through the silent atrium, commanding immediate respect. First came the two Air Force captains carrying the heavy locked briefcases containing the project files. Then came the major, walking with rigid military discipline, scanning the lobby for any potential security risks. And finally, stepping right into the center of the Vanguard Aerospace headquarters, surrounded by her subordinates, was me. I walked through the doors with my head held high. My Class A uniform was immaculately pressed, the dark navy blue fabric standing out like a beacon against the sea of light gray corporate suits in the lobby. The heavy rows of colorful ribbons on my chest silently displayed my years of combat deployments, international logistics operations, and strategic command. And resting perfectly on both of my shoulders, catching the bright fluorescent lights of the atrium, were the solid silver eagles, the undeniable universal insignia of a full-bird colonel in the United States Air Force. I paused for a fraction of a second, allowing my eyes to sweep across the massive lobby. The entire building had essentially frozen. Hundreds of employees were standing dead still, holding their breath as they watched the highest-ranking military official they had ever seen enter their domain. My face was a mask of absolute authority. I was not the quiet sister who sat submissively at Sunday dinner taking insults from her family. I was the director of defense acquisitions, and I owned every single inch of this room. But Trent did not see a colonel. Trent did not see the silver eagles shining on my shoulders or the impressive stack of combat ribbons on my chest. His arrogant mind was so entirely consumed by his own false reality that he literally could not process the visual evidence right in front of his face. When he looked at me walking through those glass doors, he did not see the commanding officer of the Pentagon Review Board. He saw the broke sister who allegedly lived in free government housing. He saw the woman he had just threatened and belittled over a plate of macaroni and cheese 3 days ago. His brain frantically scrambled to make sense of my presence and immediately settled on the most insulting and absurd conclusion possible. He assumed that I was just a low-level security escort or a glorified administrative assistant who had been assigned to carry bags for the actual VIPs. He assumed I had tagged along with the military convoy just to sneak into his building, ruin his big day, and embarrass him in front of his colleagues. From his spot near the elevators, my father Richard also spotted me. I saw his eyes widen in sheer panic. He immediately took a step backward, trying to hide himself behind a large, decorative potted plant, desperately hoping that his floor manager buddies would not associate him with the lowly government worker who had clearly wandered into the wrong high-level corporate event. Trent's confident corporate smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. He felt profoundly disrespected that I had actually shown up to his workplace after he explicitly banned me from his life. He genuinely believed that my presence was a deliberate and petty attempt to sabotage his pitch by associating him with low-ranking military personnel. He thought I was there to cause a scene about the $50,000 loan. He did not hesitate. Blinded by his own monumental ego and completely ignoring the heavy security presence flanking me, Trent stepped directly into the cleared pathway. He aggressively marched right toward the center of the military convoy, his face flushed with anger and his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The two Air Force captains walking slightly ahead of me immediately noticed the hostile civilian rapidly approaching our formation. Their training kicked in instantly. They shifted their weight, narrowing the gap to block his path, their hands hovering instinctively near their sides, ready to intercept a potential threat to their commanding officer. But I raised my right hand just an inch, a silent but absolute command for my subordinates to stand down and let the man approach. I wanted to see exactly how deep Trent was willing to dig his own grave. I watched him march right up to me, absolutely furious, entirely unaware that he was stepping right into the jaws of a trap he could never escape. Trent marched straight through the silent lobby, his leather shoes smacking aggressively against the marble. He completely ignored the heavy tension in the air and the obvious military formation surrounding me. His eyes were locked dead onto my face, burning with a mixture of contempt and panic. He stopped directly in front of me entirely, disregarding all professional boundaries and corporate etiquette. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Trent reached out and tightly grabbed my right arm. "What the hell do you think you are doing here?" he hissed, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper, meant only for me. His fingers dug sharply into the sleeve of my Class A uniform. "Are you completely insane, Simone? Did you seriously tag along with a federal security detail just to sneak into my building and embarrass me?" I stopped walking. The entire military convoy behind me stopped in perfect unison. The sudden halt of our formation sent a shockwave of alarm through the vanguard security guards stationed nearby, but they remained frozen, unsure of how to handle an altercation involving a high-ranking federal officer. Trent leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine, his breath smelling strongly of bitter artisan coffee and sheer panic. "Get out of here right now," Trent demanded, giving my arm a rough shake. "Mr. Sterling is right behind you, and if he sees you causing a scene in his lobby, my promotion is completely ruined. I told you on Sunday that you are banned from my life. I am calling building security to have you escorted off the premises before you humiliate this entire family." Over Trent's shoulder, I could see my father Richard reacting to the scene. He had been hyping up his son-in-law all morning, but the moment he saw Trent physically grab a member of the military detail, his artificial courage completely evaporated. Richard took 3 rapid steps backward, his face draining of all color until he looked practically translucent. He awkwardly shuffled sideways and actually ducked behind a massive decorative potted plant, desperately trying to conceal himself from the unfolding disaster. The man who had pointed a greasy fork at me and demanded my absolute obedience was now cowering behind a synthetic ficus tree, terrified that his floor manager buddies would realize he was related to the woman causing the disturbance. I did not look at my father for more than a second. I brought my attention back to Trent. I did not pull my arm away. I did not flinch or react to his physical aggression. I simply lowered my gaze and stared directly at his hand. I stared at his manicured fingers gripping the dark navy blue fabric of my uniform, right below the silver eagles resting on my shoulder. The silence in the atrium was absolute. The junior analysts and receptionists who had been listening to Trent brag just moments ago were now watching him with wide, horrified eyes. My 2 Air Force captains were standing so rigidly tense that I could hear the faint creak of their leather gear. They were waiting for a single nod from me to physically subdue the civilian who had just assaulted their commanding officer. But I wanted Trent to fully experience this moment. I wanted him to hang suspended in his own arrogant delusion for just a few seconds longer, before I cut the rope and let him plummet. "Let go of my uniform, Trent," I said, my voice dangerously low and echoing with absolute chilling authority. "You are making a catastrophic mistake." Trent scoffed, completely missing the deadly serious warning in my tone. "Do not use that fake commanding voice with me, Simone," he spat, tightening his grip. "You do not give orders here. You are just a broke government worker who stamps papers. Now turn around and walk out those doors before I have you thrown out." Before I could even open my mouth to respond, a blur of dark gray suit fabric rushed past my left shoulder. CEO Sterling had finally caught up to the procession. He had watched the entire interaction from the entrance, and his face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Sterling understood exactly who I was, and he understood exactly what it meant when a mid-level project manager physically assaulted the director of defense acquisitions in the middle of a corporate lobby. It meant the immediate death of a $500 million contract. Sterling did not yell. He did not ask for an explanation. He threw his entire body weight forward and violently shoved Trent away from me. The impact was brutal and entirely unexpected. Sterling hit Trent square in the chest with both hands, sending the younger man stumbling backward across the highly polished marble floor. Trent's expensive leather shoes lost their traction, and he flailed wildly, his arms pinwheeling in the air before he crashed hard into a sleek, modern waiting couch. He collapsed onto the cushions, gasping for air, his eyes wide with absolute shock as he stared up at the billionaire owner of the company. Sterling did not even look at Trent to see if he was injured. He immediately spun around to face me, his chest heaving, his silk tie askew, and his face dripping with cold, nervous sweat. The powerful, ruthless CEO of Vanguard Aerospace rigidly straightened his posture and snapped a crisp, desperate salute. "Good morning, Colonel Sterling," practically shouted his voice, echoing loudly off the high glass walls of the atrium. "Welcome to Vanguard headquarters. I am so incredibly deeply sorry for that unacceptable interruption. The executive boardroom is completely prepared and ready for your inspection whenever you wish to proceed." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Colonel. Inspection. I watched the realization hit Trent like a physical blow to the head. He was still slumped against the waiting couch, rubbing his chest where Sterling had shoved him, but his hands suddenly stopped moving. His arrogant, flushed face went completely gray. His jaw slowly dropped open, and his eyes darted frantically from the silver eagles on my shoulders to the heavy locked briefcases held by my captains, and finally to the terrified, sweating face of his CEO, who was currently standing at rigid attention, waiting for my permission to lower his hand. The alphanumeric code from the manila folder on Sunday flashed behind his eyes. The comment I made about double-checking his math, the absolute certainty I displayed when I told him I would see him on Wednesday. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together inside his brain, utterly destroying the false reality he had lived in for years. Trent tried to stand up. He placed his hands on the armrest of the couch and pushed himself forward, trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. But his body simply refused to cooperate. His knees physically buckled beneath him. They folded like cheap folding chairs, sending him crashing right back down onto the cushions. He sat there completely paralyzed, a broken, empty shell of a man staring up at the broke sister who held his entire corporate existence firmly in her hands. I looked at CEO Sterling and offered a slow, deliberate nod, acknowledging his salute. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dead silent lobby. "Please lead the way. We have a $500 million proposal to audit, and I am very eager to see if your project managers are as competent as they claim to be." I stepped forward, stepping right past Trent without giving him a second glance. The military convoy fell into step flawlessly behind me, leaving the completely shattered future vice president hyperventilating on a lobby couch, while my father remained curled into a ball of sheer terror behind a synthetic plant. The game was over, and the slaughter in the boardroom was about to begin. Mr. Sterling practically tripped over his own expensive leather shoes, rushing ahead to guide us toward the private executive elevators. The ride up to the top floor of the Vanguard Aerospace headquarters was suffocatingly silent. The only sound was the soft mechanical hum of the elevator car and the heavy, nervous breathing of the corporate executives who had awkwardly squeezed in alongside my military detail. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, watching the digital floor numbers climb higher and higher. Mr. Sterling kept casting terrified sideways glances at the silver eagles resting on my shoulders, clearly trying to calculate just how much damage had been done in his lobby. When the polished steel doors finally slid open, we stepped out into the absolute pinnacle of corporate luxury. The top floor was a sprawling expanse of rich dark wood, thick plush carpets, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline. Sterling aggressively ushered my team into the main executive boardroom. The room was massive, dominated by a highly polished mahogany table, easily large enough to seat 30 people comfortably. Without waiting for anyone to offer me a chair or direct me to a specific spot, I walked directly to the absolute head of the table. It was the seat traditionally reserved for the chairman of the board, but today it belonged entirely to me. I sat down, smoothing the skirt of my Class A uniform with deliberate precision. My two Air Force captains immediately took the seats flanking me, opening their heavy briefcases and stacking the classified physical files neatly on the polished wood. Major Evans stood at rigid attention near the double doors securing the perimeter of the room and ensuring no unauthorized personnel could enter or leave. The Vanguard executives scrambled to find seats on the opposite end of the long table, looking like terrified schoolchildren who had just been called into the principal's office. They opened their laptops with shaking hands, completely unnerved by the heavy military presence in their usually comfortable domain. But there was one critical person missing from the room. Mr. Sterling noticed the absence immediately. He frantically barked an order to his chief of staff, demanding to know where his lead project manager was hiding. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy boardroom doors swung open again, and Trent was practically pushed inside by a pair of aggressive corporate security guards. The future vice president of Vanguard Aerospace looked completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, polished corporate shark I had seen holding court in the lobby just 15 minutes ago was entirely gone. His expensive tailored suit jacket was rumpled, his silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck, and his face was the sickly pale color of wet concrete. He had clearly tried to run or hide after his collapse in the atrium, but the Vanguard security team had orders to bring him upstairs to face the music. Trent stumbled toward the front of the room. His legs were shaking so violently that I could actually see the fabric of his tailored trousers vibrating. He was hyperventilating, taking short, shallow, gasping breaths that barely filled his lungs. Mr. Sterling pointed a trembling finger toward the massive projector screen at the front of the boardroom and hissed an absolute order for Trent to begin the presentation immediately. Trent slowly turned to face the long mahogany table. For the first time since we entered the building, he looked directly at me without the thick, heavy filter of his own massive ego blocking his vision. He finally saw the brutal, undeniable reality of the situation. The woman sitting at the head of the table, the woman holding the absolute legal authority to bankrupt his entire division, was the exact same woman he had verbally abused and tried to extort just 72 hours ago. He had literally stood on my parents' porch and told me that my public servant brain could not possibly comprehend his complex aerospace technology. He had threatened to ban me from his life and laughed at my uniform. Now he had to stand in front of that very same uniform and prove that his technology was worth $500 million of my defense budget. Trent reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the projector remote from the podium. He pressed the button, and the massive screen behind him flickered to life, displaying the title slide of Project Vanguard Nexus Echo 7. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. His throat was completely dry. He swallowed hard, his collar suddenly looking much too tight for his neck. "Good morning," he finally stammered, his voice cracking pathetically. He sounded like a terrified teenager failing a high school speech class, not a seasoned corporate executive. "Good morning, Colonel and distinguished members of the review board. My name is Trent, and I am the lead project manager for the Nexus Echo 7 initiative." He clicked to the next slide. It was a dense, overwhelming overview of advanced satellite telemetry data. The exact same data I had spent 3 weeks aggressively tearing apart inside a secure briefing room at the Pentagon. Trent tried to recite his memorized corporate pitch, but his brain was completely short-circuiting. He had built his entire career on sounding smart to people who did not know any better. He relied on flashy PowerPoint slides and empty corporate buzzwords to mask his lack of actual engineering knowledge. But today he was speaking to the ultimate authority, and he knew it. He stuttered over basic technical terminology, mispronouncing the names of his own encrypted communication protocols. He tried to explain the quantum navigation algorithms, but his voice trailed off into a pathetic whisper because he suddenly remembered telling me I was too stupid to understand quantum navigation. He was sweating so heavily now that dark, embarrassing moisture patches were rapidly blooming under the arms of his expensive suit jacket. He kept casting desperate, pleading glances down the length of the table in my direction. He was silently begging me to intervene to stop the presentation, to show him even a fraction of mercy, and save him from this horrific public execution. He wanted the sister he had bullied his entire life to throw him a lifeline. But I offered him absolutely zero comfort. My face was completely composed, a mask of cold, lethal professional detachment. I did not smile. I did not nod. I simply let him struggle. I let him stand there and completely unravel in front of his billionaire boss and the entire executive board of his company. After 3 excruciating minutes of watching him fumble blindly through the introductory slides, Trent paused. He wiped his sweaty forehead with the back of his trembling hand and looked at me, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated desperation. He was drowning, and he knew he could not fake his way through the rest of the financial projections. The entire boardroom was dead silent, waiting for my reaction to his disastrous opening. I slowly reached into my uniform pocket, my fingers wrapped around the smooth, cool metal of my heavy red fountain pen. It was the exact same red pen I had used to correct his fundamentally flawed compound interest calculations at Sunday dinner. I pulled the pen out and placed it deliberately on the polished mahogany table right next to my stack of classified files. I picked it up again and tapped the blunt end against the hard wood. The sharp, rhythmic clicking sound cut through the tense, suffocating silence of the room, echoing loudly off the glass walls like the ticking of a bomb. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, interlocking my fingers around the red pen. I looked Trent dead in his panicked eyes, stripping away the last remaining shreds of his corporate dignity. "Proceed, Trent," I said, my voice perfectly calm and laced with lethal professional courtesy. "I am absolutely fascinated to hear about your vision." Trent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his tightly knotted silk tie. He picked up the laser pointer from the podium with a violently trembling hand. Realizing that he was entirely outmatched on the actual engineering data, he desperately decided to retreat to the only sanctuary he had left. He tried to hide behind the empty corporate buzzwords and flashy graphics that had always protected him from scrutiny in the past. "Our synergistic approach to the quantum defense grids," Trent stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "It leverages paradigm-shifting agile methodologies. By focusing on holistic vertical integration, we can maximize the return on investment for the Pentagon while disrupting the traditional aerospace pipeline." He clicked rapidly through 3 slides of dense, colorful bar graphs and swirling 3-dimensional animations, hoping the rapid visual changes would hypnotize the room and distract me from the lack of actual substance. He kept talking about disruptive innovation and cross-functional paradigms, trying with everything he had to sound like the visionary genius he had pretended to be at my parents' dining room table. He refused to make eye contact with me, instead, nervously dragging his laser pointer across the screen in erratic, looping circles. I let him ramble for exactly 2 full minutes. I wanted the Vanguard Executive Board to hear the absolute hollow emptiness of his $500 million pitch. I wanted them to realize exactly who they had trusted with their most lucrative government contract. When Trent finally paused to take a shaky, wet breath, I held up my right hand. The gesture was small, but it carried the absolute weight of the United States military. Trent froze instantly, his mouth snapping shut. "Trent." I began, my voice carrying the exact same condescending rhythm and arrogant cadence he had used on me just 3 days prior. "Let me explain something to you, since you clearly do not understand how the real world operates outside of your little corporate bubble. The military is not a bloated bureaucracy that just throws taxpayer money at guys like you to solve our problems." I watched his eyes widen as he recognized his own insulting words being fed directly back to him in front of his billionaire boss. I opened the classified folder resting on the mahogany table and pulled out a thick stack of documents. Every single page was heavily annotated in bright red ink. "Let us start with your financial projections," I said, sliding the first page toward the center of the table so the other executives could see it. "Slide 14 details a $40 million expenditure for proprietary research and development regarding your satellite communication arrays. However, my team cross-referenced your component list. You are not developing new technology. You are simply repackaging commercially available civilian transponders, putting them in a shiny metal box, and marking up the price by 400%. That is not vertical integration, Trent. That is war profiteering." Frantic whispers broke out at the far end of the table. The chief financial officer of Vanguard leaned forward, pushing his glasses up his nose as his face turned an alarming shade of purple. Trent opened his mouth, stammering something incoherent about supply chain logistics and market fluctuations, but I cut him off immediately. "Do not interrupt me!" I snapped the command, echoing sharply off the glass walls. "I am not finished." I pulled up the next document from my folder. "Let us move on to the complex aerospace technology that you claimed my little public servant brain could not possibly comprehend." Go back to slide 9. The structural schematic for the Nexus Echo 7 payload module. Trent fumbled with the presentation remote, dropping it onto the podium before desperately snatching it back up. He clicked back to the requested slide. The massive screen displayed a highly detailed blueprint of a satellite housing unit. This schematic, I continued tapping my red pen against the wood, is not an original Vanguard innovation. It is a nearly identical copy of a patented orbital housing unit developed by Lockheed Martin 3 years ago. You did not even bother to change the structural load capacities. You just slapped a Vanguard Aerospace logo on a stolen tech design and expected the Department of Defense to hand you a massive check. You are pitching us our own defense contractors' stolen intellectual property. CEO. Sterling gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He had just realized his lead project manager was attempting to commit federal fraud right in front of him. The legal implications alone were enough to completely sink the company's stock. And finally, I said, leaning back in my heavy leather chair and locking my eyes dead onto Trent. "Let us talk about your telemetry calculations, the complex math you use to guarantee the orbital stability of these defense grids." I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch until it was physically agonizing for the man standing at the podium. "The math is fundamentally flawed. You missed a critical decimal point in your atmospheric drag coefficient on page 42. It throws off the entire trajectory matrix. If we actually built what you are proposing, your satellites would literally burn up upon re-entry within 6 months." I tilted my head, offering him a cold, completely empty smile. "I warned you on Sunday to make sure your math was better. But apparently you are just as bad at calculating orbital trajectories as you are at calculating compound interest on a $50,000 loan. Did you honestly expect the United States Air Force to trust $500 million of national security infrastructure to a man who cannot even pass a high school algebra test?" The destruction was absolute and surgical. Trent had no corporate buzzwords left to hide behind. The flashy graphics on the screen behind him now looked like damning criminal evidence of his gross incompetence. He looked frantically around the room, desperately seeking a friendly face or a lifeline, but he found nothing. The Vanguard executives were staring at him with pure, murderous intent. He had humiliated their entire company in front of the Pentagon. He had jeopardized their quarterly earnings, their massive bonuses, and their professional reputations, just so he could play pretend executive. Trent was completely paralyzed. His hands gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his fingers were trembling. A single drop of sweat rolled down his forehead and stung his eye, but he did not even blink. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own, making utterly destroyed by the woman he had spent years treating like dirt. CEO Sterling could not contain his panic for another second. The billionaire stood up from his chair so fast it tipped over backwards and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. He completely ignored it, marching halfway down the length of the boardroom table until he was standing just a few feet away from his paralyzed project manager. Sterling was practically vibrating with rage, his face a dark shade of crimson. Trent Sterling growled, his voice a dangerous low rumble that shook the room. "I want an explanation right now. Who approved these fraudulent numbers? Who authorized the inclusion of stolen schematics in a federal presentation? Look at me when I am talking to you. You are playing with the survival of this company, and I demand to know exactly how this garbage made it into my boardroom." The heavy echoes of CEO Sterling's furious demands bounced off the thick glass walls of the executive boardroom. He was standing over Trent, his face a dark mask of corporate rage, waiting for an answer that Trent simply did not have. Trent opened his mouth a few times, his jaw working up and down, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own failure. He looked like a cornered animal realizing for the first time that the trap had finally snapped shut. I did not let the billionaire CEO maintain control of my interrogation. I leaned forward slowly, deliberately, pressing my elbows against the polished mahogany table and interlocking my fingers. The simple, quiet movement instantly drew every single eye in the room back to me. "Mr. Sterling, please take your seat," I said, my voice completely level but carrying an absolute, unquestionable authority. "Yelling at your project manager will not fix the underlying issue we have uncovered here today." Sterling instantly stopped shouting. He closed his mouth, swallowed his pride, and quickly lowered himself back into his heavy leather chair. He nodded deferentially toward me, folding his hands tightly in his lap. The billionaire executive who commanded thousands of employees was now taking direct orders from me, and Trent was forced to watch his ultimate corporate idol submit to my authority. "The core issue here is not just a few stolen schematics or a misplaced decimal point," I said, addressing the entire Vanguard executive board. My eyes swept down the long table, meeting the gaze of every single terrified vice president and financial officer. "The issue is a profound, fundamental lack of basic financial literacy and basic professional competence." I turned my attention back to Trent, who was still gripping the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "I am going to share a brief personal anecdote with this board," I continued, my voice echoing clearly through the silent room. "Just 3 days ago, this very man sat across from me at a family dinner table. He had invited me to his home under the guise of family bonding. Instead, right in the middle of Sunday dinner, he slid a formal bank loan application across my plate. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the Vanguard executives. The chief financial officer leaned forward, pushing his glasses up his nose, clearly trying to understand where I was going with this. He demanded that I co-sign a $50,000 banknote, I explained, keeping my eyes locked on Trent's rapidly paling face. He needed the cash not for an emergency or a vital medical expense, but to build a luxury heated swimming pool in his backyard and upgrade his country club membership. He claimed his capital was currently tied up in aggressive stock portfolios, but the truth was simply that he could not afford the lifestyle he was desperately trying to project. The executives at the table turned their heads slowly to look at Trent. The confusion in their eyes was rapidly being replaced by sheer, unadulterated disgust. The man who had strutted into their offices demanding to be made a vice president, the man who claimed to hold the keys to a $500 million military contract, was secretly begging his sister-in-law for backyard pool money over a plate of macaroni and cheese. It was the ultimate destruction of his carefully crafted corporate facade. But that is not the worst part. I continued, my voice cutting through the heavy tension like a perfectly sharpened blade. To convince me to sign that $50,000 loan, he presented an amortization schedule. He wanted to prove that he could easily pay the bank back. But his math was completely, fundamentally wrong. He entirely failed to calculate the compound interest. His projected monthly payments were off by thousands of dollars. He could not even comprehend the basic financial mechanics of a standard personal loan. I unclasped my fingers and placed my hands flat on the table, framing the classified documents in front of me. I looked directly at the chief financial officer and then back to CEO Sterling. "So, I have to ask this board a very simple question. If your lead project manager cannot accurately calculate the interest on a $50,000 backyard swimming pool, how on earth do you expect him to manage $500 million of federal taxpayer money without committing gross negligence?" The silence that followed was completely devastating. It was not just quiet, it was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that pulled all the oxygen out of the room. The executives looked at Trent as if he were a disease. The chief financial officer actually shook his head in absolute revulsion, tossing his pen onto the table and crossing his arms. They realized in that exact moment that Trent was not a visionary. He was not a corporate prodigy. He was an incompetent fraud who had somehow slipped through the cracks of their human resources department and nearly brought the entire Department of Defense crashing down on their heads. Trent was completely unraveling. The thick sheen of nervous sweat on his forehead was now dripping down the side of his face, soaking into his expensive silk collar. His chest heaved as he took short, desperate breaths. He knew his career at Vanguard Aerospace was entirely over. He knew he was never getting that executive suite or the massive promotion. But the panic gripping his chest went far beyond losing a job. He had just presented falsified data and stolen intellectual property to a federal review board. He had attempted to defraud the United States government out of $500 million. That was not just a fireable offense. That was a massive federal crime. Trent was suddenly staring down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence and the absolute loss of everything he had ever valued. Desperation is a very dangerous emotion. When a man like Trent, a man completely obsessed with his own survival and completely devoid of actual integrity, is backed into a corner, he does not take responsibility. He does not apologize or accept the consequences of his actions. He looks for a scapegoat. He looks for someone, anybody else, to absorb the fatal blow. His panicked eyes darted wildly around the executive boardroom, searching for a way out. He looked at the furious CEO. He looked at the disgusted financial officers. He looked at my cold, unyielding expression. And then his frantic gaze shot past the mahogany table, bypassing the executives entirely, and landing squarely on the shadows at the very back of the room. My father Richard had quietly slipped into the back of the boardroom right before the presentation began. Trent had specifically arranged for him to be placed on the approved guest list as a technical advisor for the manufacturing floor. But the reality was that my father was only there to serve as Trent's personal cheerleader. Richard had wanted a front-row seat to watch his golden son-in-law conquer the corporate world and embarrass the military sister they both despised. Instead, my father was currently pressed hard against the back wall, trying to make himself as small as physically possible. He had witnessed the entire systematic dismantling of his son-in-law's career. He had heard the revelation about the swimming pool loan, and he had seen the absolute fury of the billionaire CEO. Richard looked terrified, gripping a leather portfolio to his chest like a protective shield. Trent stared at my father, and I saw the exact moment the dark, cowardly idea took root in his mind. Trent knew he could not defend the stolen structural schematics, but he needed someone to take the fall for the falsified numbers and the padded budgets. He needed someone who handled the actual physical manufacturing data. He needed someone lower on the corporate ladder whom he could easily throw to the wolves. Trent's breathing suddenly hitched. He stood up a little straighter, gripping the edges of the podium. His face twisted into a mask of completely fake righteous indignation. He raised his trembling right arm and pointed a rigid finger directly over the heads of the Vanguard executives, aiming straight at his own father-in-law, sitting in the back row. Trent's trembling arm remained rigidly extended, his index finger pointing like a loaded weapon across the expanse of the executive boardroom. His frantic eyes were locked onto my father Richard, who was desperately trying to blend into the dark mahogany paneling at the back of the room. The absolute silence that had suffocated the space was suddenly shattered by Trent's desperate, reedy voice. He was no longer trying to sound like a visionary leader. He was fighting for his actual freedom, and he was entirely willing to sacrifice anyone standing in his way. "It was not me," Trent practically shouted, his voice cracking, as he looked back and forth between CEO Sterling and the furious executive board. "I did not generate those financial projections or the telemetry schematics. I am the project manager. I oversee the macro-level logistics. I relied on the data provided directly by the manufacturing floor. All of those cost estimates, the structural load capacities, the raw material budgets, they were all compiled and submitted by the senior floor supervisor." Trent turned his body fully toward the back of the room, making sure every single executive followed his gaze. "He is sitting right there," Trent accused, jabbing his finger through the air. "Richard is the one who supplied the fraudulent manufacturing data. He assured me the numbers were solid. He bypassed the standard quality assurance protocols and submitted the final budget directly to my desk. If there are massive discrepancies in the cost analysis and stolen structural designs, you need to be looking at him, not me." The entire boardroom pivoted in their heavy leather chairs. Every single high-powered executive, the chief financial officer, the legal counsel, and the billionaire CEO, turned to look at the blue-collar floor supervisor cowering in the shadows. The spotlight of federal fraud and corporate ruin had violently shifted, and it was now burning directly onto my father. I watched the physical collapse of the man who had raised me. Richard stood frozen against the back wall, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled out of water. The leather portfolio he had been clutching to his chest slipped from his trembling hands and hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud, spilling loose papers across the carpet. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly grayish white. He looked as if he had just been physically struck. This was the exact same man who had proudly clapped Trent on the back 3 days ago. This was the man who had pointed a greasy fork at my chest and demanded that I apologize to his golden son-in-law. Richard had practically worshipped Trent, viewing him as the absolute pinnacle of corporate success and the savior of our family's social standing. He had stood in his own hallway and told me that Trent was a real provider while actively helping him extort $50,000 from me. And now, in the middle of a corporate massacre, that very same golden son-in-law was looking him dead in the eye and handing him over to federal investigators without a single second of hesitation. "Trent, what are you doing?" My father finally managed to choke out his voice, a pathetic, raspy whisper that barely carried across the room. "I do not understand the quantum telemetry. I do not run the engineering department. I just manage the assembly line." Trent did not show an ounce of remorse. In fact, seeing my father stumble over his words seemed to give Trent a sudden surge of false confidence. He gripped the edges of the podium again, standing up straighter and fully leaning into his desperate lie. "Richard has been struggling with the new digital inventory systems for months." Trent lied smoothly, looking back at CEO Sterling with a perfectly manufactured expression of corporate concern. "He has been making catastrophic errors on the floor and trying to cover his tracks by padding the budgets and altering the structural reports. I trusted him because of our close working relationship. I trusted my senior supervisor. He took advantage of my oversight and actively manipulated this federal proposal to hide his own gross incompetence." The absolute audacity of the betrayal was almost mesmerizing to witness. The Vanguard executives immediately began whispering among themselves, their faces hardening. They were desperate for a scapegoat. They needed someone to take the fall for this disastrous presentation so they could salvage their relationship with the Department of Defense. And a senior floor supervisor nearing retirement age was a much easier target to sacrifice than a highly paid white-collar project manager. They were already mentally drafting the termination paperwork and the press release, blaming a rogue blue-collar employee for the data breach. My father realized exactly what was happening. He realized that the executives were actually believing Trent's lie. The corporate hierarchy was closing ranks to protect itself, and he was being thrown directly to the wolves. Richard looked around the room, his eyes wide with sheer terror. He was completely isolated. His floor manager buddies were not here to back him up. His wife was not here to scream and bully people into submission. He was standing in the most powerful room in the building, and he had absolutely zero leverage. He looked at Trent, the man he had chosen over his own daughter. The illusion of family loyalty that my parents had preached for 35 years completely shattered right there on the boardroom floor. They had weaponized the concept of family to manipulate me to demand my money and to force my compliance. But the moment real pressure was applied, the moment actual stakes were on the line, Trent proved that his loyalty belonged only to his own survival. He was willing to send my father to federal prison just to buy himself a few more minutes of breathing room. Trent let out a shaky breath, clearly believing he had successfully deflected the fatal blow. He loosened his grip on the podium and offered CEO Sterling a tight, nervous nod. "I take full responsibility for trusting the wrong employee," Mr. Sterling Trent said, his voice dripping with fake humility. I will personally lead an internal investigation into the manufacturing department and ensure that Richard is prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for this sabotage." The room grew quiet again as the Vanguard executives waited to see if the Military Review Board would accept this explanation. They all slowly turned their attention back to the head of the mahogany table, back to me. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly over my classified documents. I had audited every single page of Project Vanguard Nexus Echo 7. I knew exactly who had accessed the encrypted files, who had drafted the budget, and who had illegally downloaded the Lockheed Martin schematics. Every digital footprint, every financial authorization code, and every encrypted email tied directly back to Trent's secure corporate terminal. My father did not possess the security clearance, the technical knowledge, or the digital access required to commit even a fraction of the fraud contained in that proposal. Trent was lying through his teeth, and I held the undeniable documented proof of his perjury. But I did not immediately present the evidence. I wanted my father to feel the absolute crushing weight of his own terrible choices. I wanted him to stand in the back of that room entirely stripped of his unearned pride and realize that the man he had fiercely defended was a cowardly, manipulative fraud. I slowly turned my heavy leather chair slightly to the right, breaking my line of sight with Trent and focusing entirely on the dark corner of the room. The Vanguard executives followed my gaze, perfectly silent. I looked past the terrified billionaire CEO and the disgusted financial officers. I locked my eyes directly onto my father. Richard was trembling visibly, holding his hands up in a weak, defensive gesture, his eyes pleading with me to save him from the monster he had helped create. I kept my expression completely neutral, an unreadable mask of military discipline. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my intertwined fingers. I raised a single eyebrow, allowing my voice to cut through the heavy silence with cold, surgical precision. "Is that true, Richard? Are you responsible for this fraud?" My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. The crushing reality of his situation had entirely paralyzed his vocal cords. He looked at Trent, the man he had idolized, and then he looked back at me, the daughter he had spent 35 years underestimating. He finally managed a weak shake of his head, his eyes welling up with tears of sheer panic. He quietly stammered that he did not know anything about the advanced telemetry or the budget padding. He admitted in front of the entire executive board that he had simply signed the electronic approval forms because Trent had told him to do it. He confessed that Trent had promised him a massive year-end bonus if he bypassed the standard quality assurance protocols and pushed the paperwork through without asking any questions. That was all CEO Sterling needed to hear. The billionaire had reached his absolute breaking point. Sterling slammed his hand flat against the heavy mahogany table with such explosive force that several of the executives physically jumped in their seats. "Enough," Sterling roared, his voice shaking the glass walls of the boardroom. The furious CEO turned his entire body toward the podium, his eyes burning with a rage that could melt steel. "Trent, you are terminated effective immediately." Sterling barked his words, striking like physical blows. "You are entirely stripped of your title, your security clearance, and your stock options. You are not getting a promotion to vice president. You are getting a federal investigation. You have single-handedly jeopardized the most lucrative government contract in the history of Vanguard Aerospace. You brought stolen intellectual property into my boardroom, and you attempted to defraud the United States military. And then when you were caught, you had the absolute cowardly audacity to try and blame a blue-collar floor supervisor for your own malicious crimes." The polished corporate armor that Trent had worn his entire adult life completely shattered into a million pieces. The arrogant, mid-level project manager who had bragged to junior receptionists and threatened to ban me from his imaginary mansion was suddenly gone. In his place was a completely broken, terrified man. Trent collapsed against the wooden podium, gripping the edges just to keep himself from falling to the floor. And then he started to cry. It was not a quiet, dignified shedding of tears. It was a loud, pathetic, ugly sobbing. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, tears streaming down his flushed face and dripping onto his expensive silk tie. He looked around the room, begging the other executives to intervene, but they all turned their heads away in absolute revulsion. Nobody was going to save him. Sterling reached across the table and slammed his finger onto the intercom button. He ordered corporate security to enter the boardroom immediately. Within seconds, the heavy double doors swung open and two massive security guards stepped inside. "Get this man out of my building," Sterling ordered, pointing a shaking finger at Trent. "Revoke his building access, confiscate his company phone, and do not let him leave the lobby until the federal authorities have been notified of the fraud." The security guards marched forward and grabbed Trent by both arms. The physical contact completely broke whatever fragile composure he had left. He started thrashing wildly, his expensive leather shoes scraping frantically against the carpet. He looked directly at me, his face twisted in absolute terror and desperation. "Simone, please," he wailed, his voice cracking hysterically as the guards dragged him away from the podium. "Simone, you have to stop them. We are family. You cannot do this to Jasmine. We are going to lose the house. I am going to prison. Please tell them it was a mistake. I will sign whatever you want. I will apologize. Please." I sat perfectly still in my heavy leather chair, watching the pathetic display with cold detachment. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I just watched him being dragged backward toward the doors. 3 days ago, he had stood on my parents' porch, puffing his chest out and telling me not to come crying to him when I was broke at 40. Now he was the one crying, weeping openly in front of his billionaire boss, begging the broke sister for a lifeline he absolutely did not deserve. The heavy boardroom doors slammed shut, cutting off his pathetic wailing and leaving a dense, ringing silence in the room. Sterling stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as he tried to regain his corporate composure. He straightened his suit jacket and turned his attention to the back of the room. My father was still pressed against the wall, looking completely devastated by the horrific scene he had just witnessed. Richard Sterling said, his voice cold and devoid of any sympathy, "You are suspended without pay, effective immediately." My father gasped, his hands flying up to his chest. "Mr. Sterling, please," he begged, his voice trembling. "I did not know about the stolen technology. I just signed the forms like he asked. I have worked on the manufacturing floor for 20 years. I am 2 years away from my pension. You cannot do this to me. You bypassed critical quality assurance protocols and blindly approved fraudulent federal budgets because your son-in-law promised you a bonus," Sterling countered ruthlessly. "I do not care if you were actively malicious or just grossly incompetent. Your negligence allowed this disaster to reach my boardroom. Your suspension is pending a full internal and federal investigation. If we find out you actively colluded with Trent, you will join him in federal prison. If you are just an idiot, you are simply fired and your pension is gone. Now get out of my sight before I have security drag you out as well." Richard looked absolutely destroyed. His shoulders slumped forward, carrying the crushing weight of his ruined career and his shattered pride. He looked toward the head of the table, staring directly at me. His eyes were begging for intervention. He was silently pleading with his eldest daughter, the colonel, to use her massive influence to save his job and his retirement. He wanted the family loyalty he had so aggressively demanded on Sunday. I met his gaze and held it. I gave him absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just the cold, hard reality of the consequences he had actively chosen. He had backed the wrong horse and now he had to pay the ultimate price. He slowly turned around, his head hung low in utter defeat, and quietly walked out of the boardroom, closing the door softly behind him. With the two most toxic elements of my family completely removed from the premises, the atmosphere in the executive boardroom shifted dramatically. The Vanguard executives were still pale and terrified, staring at their laptops and waiting for the final blow to fall. They fully expected me to pack up my classified documents, walk out of the building, and immediately cancel their $500 million contract. CEO Sterling slowly walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his silk handkerchief, and wiped the thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead. He looked at me across the expanse of the polished mahogany table. The billionaire CEO was completely stripped of his corporate arrogance. He was a desperate man, sitting on the edge of total financial ruin, and he knew that his entire empire rested solely in my hands. Colonel Simone Sterling began, his voice quiet and incredibly respectful. I do not even know how to begin apologizing for the catastrophic embarrassment you have endured today. I am profoundly horrified by the actions of those two men. He leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the table, practically begging me with his eyes. Please, Colonel, do not pull this contract. Vanguard Aerospace has a long and proud history of serving the Department of Defense. This was the action of a rogue, incompetent manager, not a reflection of our company values. I will do whatever the military requires to make this right. I will completely restructure the project management team today. I will open all of our books for a full forensic federal audit. Just tell me what you need, and I will make it happen immediately. Please give us a chance to fix this. The most powerful man in the building was pleading for his professional life. I placed my hands on the table, feeling the smooth wood beneath my palms. The absolute power I held in that moment was intoxicating, but I maintained my strict military discipline. I had completely destroyed the men who had disrespected me, and now it was time to rebuild the contract on my exact terms. I looked at the billionaire CEO sitting across from me, completely stripped of his pride and desperately waiting for my verdict. I slowly stood up from the heavy leather chair. My two Air Force captains immediately mirrored my movements, snapping to rigid attention and snapping the classified briefcases shut. The sharp metallic clicks of the briefcase locks echoed through the silent boardroom, signaling that the presentation was officially over. Vanguard Aerospace is deeply integrated into our national defense supply chain, Mr. Sterling, I said, looking down at him. Pulling this contract entirely today would cause logistical delays that the United States military cannot afford right now. That is the only reason your company is not being permanently blacklisted from all federal databases at this exact moment. A massive wave of relief washed over Sterling's face. He let out a shaky breath and actually closed his eyes for a second, whispering a quiet word of thanks to whatever higher power he believed in. But his relief was entirely premature. However, I continued, my voice hardening, making it absolutely clear that he was not off the hook. You are not getting the $500 million commitment Trent Arrogant promised you. I am granting Vanguard Aerospace a strict 6-month probationary contract. During this period, your entire project management division will undergo a complete aggressive restructuring. I want every single mid-level executive thoroughly vetted and evaluated for basic technical competence. Sterling nodded frantically, pulling a pen from his breast pocket and scrambling to write down my demands on a legal pad. Yes, Colonel, absolutely. A complete restructuring starting this afternoon. Furthermore, I said, leaning forward slightly, Vanguard will submit to a full forensic financial audit conducted by independent federal investigators. We are going to dig through every single line item, every material cost, and every employee authorization code associated with the Nexus Echo 7 project. If we find any further evidence of stolen intellectual property or inflated billing, Vanguard Aerospace will be prosecuted, and your company will cover the entire cost of this federal audit. Do you understand these terms, Mr. Sterling? I understand, completely. Colonel Sterling replied, his voice thick with genuine gratitude. I personally guarantee that we will be fully transparent and compliant with every single demand. You have my word, and you have the full cooperation of this executive board. Thank you. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to correct this catastrophic failure. I did not smile or offer any warm reassurances. I simply reached down and picked up my military cover from the table. I placed the hat on my head, adjusting the brim with precise, deliberate movements until it sat perfectly aligned. I picked up my red fountain pen, the weapon that had completely unraveled a $500 million fraud, and slid it back into my uniform pocket. Good day, gentlemen. I said, offering a crisp, curt nod to the room. I turned and walked out of the executive boardroom, my military detail falling flawlessly into step behind me. The Vanguard executives remained seated perfectly silent until the heavy double doors clicked shut behind us. The elevator ride down to the lobby was a completely different experience than the ride up. There was no nervous corporate sweating, there was no suffocating tension. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a mission perfectly executed. When the polished steel doors slid open on the ground floor, the massive glass atrium was completely deserted. The junior analysts and receptionists who had formed Trent's eager audience earlier that morning had all vanished, likely ordered back to their desks by a terrified human resources department. The only people left in the lobby were the security guards, who stood at rigid attention as I walked past. The spot on the luxury waiting couch where Trent had physically collapsed just an hour ago was empty. The decorative potted plant where my father had cowered in fear stood alone in the corner. The corporate temple where they had worshipped their own superiority had been completely cleansed. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright, crisp morning air. My armored government motorcade was waiting exactly where I had left it, the engines idling smoothly. The stress of the past 3 days, the toxic Sunday dinner, the yelling, the ridiculous loan document, the physical assault in the lobby, it all fell away from my shoulders. I had severed the rotting branches of my family tree, and the fresh air felt absolutely incredible. I reached out to grab the heavy handle of my SUV door. At that exact moment, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my uniform jacket. I paused, pulling my hand back from the door. Very few people had this private number. I reached into my pocket and pulled the phone out. The bright screen illuminated, displaying a caller identification that instantly dragged me back into the chaotic reality I was just about to leave behind. It was my mother, Brenda. I stood on the pavement next to the armored vehicle, watching the screen flash. I knew exactly why she was calling. Trent had been dragged out of the boardroom in tears, stripped of his phone and his dignity. But he had clearly found a way to contact his wife and his mother-in-law before security could completely force him off the corporate campus. I considered hitting the ignore button and letting the call drop to voicemail. But a small part of me wanted to hear exactly how they were going to try and spin this absolute disaster. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not even have the chance to say hello. The audio coming through the small speaker was absolute unfiltered chaos. It sounded like a war zone inside my parents' house. In the background, I could hear the distinct sound of glass shattering against a wall, followed immediately by a long, high-pitched shriek. Jasmine was screaming hysterically. It was a guttural, panicked wailing that drowned out almost everything else. I could hear her screaming about her ruined life, her canceled country club membership, and the sheer humiliation of being married to an unemployed fraud. Simone. My mother's voice blasted through the receiver, shrill and trembling with unhinged fury. Simone, are you there? Answer me right now. I am here. Mom, I replied, my voice calm and steady, a sharp contrast to the sheer lunacy happening on her end of the line. What did you do? My mother screamed, her voice cracking. What the hell did you just do? Trent just called Jasmine, crying from a payphone at a gas station down the street from his office. He said security dragged him out of the building. He said you brought a federal investigation down on his head and that the CEO fired him on the spot. He said he is facing prison time, Simone. Prison. I listened to her panicked breathing, noting that she did not ask if Trent had actually committed a crime. She did not ask why he was fired. She only cared that the golden goose had been slaughtered. Trent was fired because he attempted to defraud the United States government. Mom, I explained, keeping my tone entirely factual. He presented falsified budgets and stolen technology to my review board. And when he was caught, he tried to blame Dad for the entire thing. Did Trent mention that part on his frantic phone call? Did he mention that he tried to send your husband to federal prison to save his own skin? My mother completely ignored the revelation about my father. Her brain was entirely locked onto the loss of Trent's income and the destruction of Jasmine's vanity projects. "You did this on purpose," Brenda shrieked the accusation, hitting my ear like a physical blow. "You went to his workplace with your little army friends, and you sabotaged his presentation. You ruined his pitch because you are jealous of his success. You could not handle the fact that he was going to be a vice president, so you destroyed him." "Mom, Trent destroyed himself," I replied firmly. "He is a fraud. He has always been a fraud. He did not even know how to calculate the compound interest on that ridiculous pool loan he tried to force on me. I do not care about the math," my mother roared into the phone, entirely abandoning all logic and reason. "I care that your sister is currently on the floor having a panic attack because her husband has no job. I care that we are about to be completely humiliated in front of our entire neighborhood." Jasmine let out another piercing scream in the background, followed by the sound of something heavy overturning in their living room. "You listen to me, Simone," my mother commanded, her voice dropping into a harsh, desperate growl. "You are going to fix this. Do you hear me? You are going to turn your little government cars around right now. You are going to march back into that building and you are going to tell that CEO that you made a mistake. You are going to demand that he gives Trent his job back, and you are going to give Vanguard that massive contract. You have to fix this, Simone. You are destroying the family." I did not engage. I did not scream back into the receiver or attempt to inject logic into a mind that was completely consumed by superficial panic. I simply lowered the phone from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off my mother's frantic demands mid-sentence. I slid the phone back into my pocket and climbed into the spacious back seat of my armored vehicle. My driver looked at me through the rearview mirror, waiting for the signal to return to the military base. I gave him a different address. The drive to my parents' house was relatively short, but the heavy silence inside the cabin gave me time to fully process the sheer absurdity of my family's priorities. My father was currently facing a massive federal investigation and the complete loss of his retirement pension, yet my mother's primary concern was saving her son-in-law's corporate prestige and her daughter's country club membership. They were a family entirely built on illusions, and the moment real consequences shattered their fantasy, they immediately demanded that I fix it for them. The motorcade glided smoothly into the affluent suburban neighborhood, the heavy black government vehicles standing out in stark contrast to the bright manicured lawns and pastel-colored luxury sedans. I ordered my driver to park directly by the curb and keep the engine running. I did not plan on staying long. I walked up the paved driveway, my polished military boots stepping firmly over the exact spot where Trent had stood 3 days prior, and aggressively threatened my financial future. The front door was slightly ajar, likely left open in whatever panicked rush Trent had made to get inside after fleeing the Vanguard Aerospace campus. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the foyer. The atmosphere inside the house was suffocating, thick with the smell of expensive floral perfume and raw, unfiltered hysteria. I walked into the living room and found the exact level of absolute chaos I had expected. Jasmine was sprawled dramatically across the expensive velvet sofa, clutching a decorative throw pillow to her chest and sobbing violently. She was not crying for my father, and she certainly was not crying over the massive federal fraud her husband had just committed. She was wailing about the canceled pool contractors. She shrieked that she had already ordered custom-imported Italian tiles, and that her friends were going to mock her relentlessly when they found out the backyard renovations were permanently halted. Her entire world was collapsing, and her only concern was neighborhood gossip. Trent was pacing frantically back and forth across the large Persian rug. He had completely abandoned the terrified weeping persona he had displayed in the executive boardroom. Back in his comfortable suburban environment, surrounded by women who enabled his delusion, he was rapidly reconstructing his shattered ego. He waved his arms wildly, loudly, explaining to my mother that he had been set up by the company. He claimed CEO Sterling was deeply intimidated by his visionary ideas, and that the Military Review Board was fundamentally corrupt. He was actually trying to convince them that his termination was a massive corporate conspiracy designed to steal his brilliance and cover up the failures of the manufacturing floor. He was sticking to the lie that my father was the mastermind behind the fraudulent data. My mother was standing near the fireplace, nervously wringing her hands and hanging onto every single lie Trent spun. When she finally noticed me standing quietly in the archway, her face contorted with absolute fury. She instantly abandoned Trent's ridiculous conspiracy theory and marched directly toward me, her eyes blazing with a toxic mixture of grief and hatred. "How dare you show your face in this house," Brenda hissed, pointing a trembling manicured finger at my uniform. "You malicious, jealous monster! You came here to gloat, did you not? You came to celebrate ruining your sister's life because you could not stand to see her happy." I ignored her completely. I did not offer a rebuttal or a defense. I had spent 35 years trying to defend my character to a woman who had already decided I was the villain. I bypassed her entirely and walked toward the main staircase. I only had one purpose for being there. I needed to retrieve a small, heavy lockbox from my old childhood bedroom. It was a box containing the only genuine mementos I actually cared about, including a few faded photographs of my late grandfather and the early military commendations I had earned before I realized my family would never be proud of my service. I wanted to pack up the last remaining pieces of my past and sever this tie permanently. But my mother refused to be ignored. The fact that I was not breaking down crying or apologizing infuriated her even more. She sprinted ahead of me, throwing herself at the bottom of the staircase and gripping the wooden banisters with both hands to physically block my path. "You are not taking another step in this house," she screamed, her voice cracking under the emotional strain. "You do not get to walk in here wearing that smug expression after what you just did. You are completely dead to us, Simone. You are a bitter, lonely woman who destroyed the only successful man in this family just to make yourself feel important." Trent stopped pacing and stood behind my mother, puffing his chest out once again. He felt perfectly safe insulting me now that he was hiding behind his mother-in-law. "You are sick in the head, Simone," Trent spat, adjusting his wrinkled suit jacket. "You abused your federal authority to target me. I am calling my lawyers. I am going to sue you and the entire Department of Defense for wrongful termination and defamation." I looked at Trent, feeling nothing but profound pity for his absolute detachment from reality. "You cannot sue the Department of Defense because you were fired for committing federal fraud." "Trent," I replied, my voice echoing calmly through the chaotic room. "And your lawyers are going to be entirely focused on keeping you out of a federal penitentiary. Do not speak to me again." My mother slammed her hand against the banister, drawing my attention back to her flushed, furious face. "Do not you dare speak to him like that," Brenda yelled. "Trent is the victim here. Your father just called me from his car in tears. He said he was suspended without pay. He said he might lose his entire pension because of your petty little revenge plot. You threw your own father to the wolves just to hurt Jasmine." I stood at the bottom step, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life protecting everyone but me. She was actively defending the man who had framed her husband for a federal crime. She was so deeply invested in the illusion of Trent's wealth that she was willing to sacrifice the man she had been married to for 40 years. She leaned forward, her face twisted with panic and rage, and delivered the ultimate guilt trip she believed would finally break my resolve. She needed to make me feel responsible for their survival, just like she always did. "How are we going to pay the mortgage without Richard's salary?" Brenda screamed, the terrifying reality of their financial ruin finally tearing through her thick layer of denial. "We rely on that paycheck to keep this roof over our heads. We are going to lose this house because of you." "What are we supposed to do, Simone?" I stopped. The sheer, unbelievable irony of her screaming about the mortgage was too perfect to ignore. I looked around the beautifully decorated foyer at the expensive imported rugs, the crystal chandelier, and the perfectly painted walls of the home I had grown up in. They believed this house was their ultimate fortress, their undeniable proof of upper-middle-class success. They believed it belonged to them. I reached inside the breast pocket of my dark blue uniform jacket. I bypassed my fountain pen and my military identification, sliding my fingers against a thick piece of premium parchment paper. I slowly pulled out a crisply folded legal document, holding it out in the space between us. I unfolded the thick premium parchment paper with slow, deliberate movements. The heavy silence in the foyer was broken only by the crisp rustle of the document. I held it out toward my mother. Brenda looked at the paper and then up at my face, her eyes darting back and forth in utter confusion. She did not reach for it immediately. She was expecting me to hand her a check. She was expecting me to finally cave to her relentless emotional terrorism, pull out my checkbook, and magically fix her entire financial reality. "Take it, Mom," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "Read the top line out loud for everyone." Brenda slowly reached out her trembling fingers, snatching the paper from my hand. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the dense legal text. Trent immediately stepped closer, peering over her shoulder, trying to use his corporate background to decipher the document. I watched their eyes scan the bold, capitalized letters at the top of the page. The confusion on my mother's face did not immediately fade. It slowly morphed into a deep, horrific realization as her brain struggled to process the irrefutable legal facts printed in black ink. "This is a property deed," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is the deed to our house." "Why do you have the deed to our house, Simone?" "It is not your house, Mom," I replied, my tone completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "It has not been your house for 5 years." Trent practically snatched the document out of her hands, his eyes frantically scanning the signature lines and the ownership transfer dates. His jaw dropped open as he read the name listed under the primary property owner. He looked at me, his face entirely drained of blood. "What does it say?" Trent Jasmine demanded, pushing herself off the velvet sofa and stomping over to where her husband stood frozen. "What is she talking about? Mom and Dad own this house. They paid off the mortgage years ago." "They did not pay off the mortgage, Jasmine," I said, turning my attention to my weeping sister. "5 years ago, our father made a series of catastrophic financial decisions. He invested heavily in a fraudulent real estate scheme that completely wiped out his savings and left this family on the absolute brink of total bankruptcy. The bank was 30 days away from foreclosing on this property. They were going to drag your custom furniture out onto the front lawn and change the locks." I paused, letting the heavy truth sink into the room. My mother looked at the floor, entirely unable to meet my gaze. She knew the truth. She had lived the nightmare of that impending foreclosure, but she had proudly buried the reality of how they had been saved. "I bought this house." I stated the words echoing off the high ceilings of the foyer like thunderclaps. "I used the money I earned from my military deployments and my private investments to purchase this property through a blind trust. I paid the bank in full. I cleared the debt. I allowed you and Dad to continue living here, paying a heavily subsidized rent that you believed was just a refinanced mortgage payment. I did it because despite the way you always treated me, I did not want to see my parents completely destitute and thrown out onto the street. I protected you." Trent stared at me, his hands shaking so violently that the heavy parchment paper rattled in his grip. The absolute magnitude of his humiliation was finally complete. He had stood in this exact house just 3 days ago and demanded that I fund his luxury swimming pool because I supposedly lived in free government housing. He had mocked my military career and told me I knew nothing about real wealth. Now he was holding the undeniable proof that his entire affluent suburban lifestyle, every holiday dinner, every country club boast, and every ounce of his borrowed prestige was secretly funded and legally owned by the exact same woman he had verbally abused. "You own the house," Jasmine whispered, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "You own the house." "I do," I confirmed, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. "And since you all value smart financial investments so highly, I have decided to completely restructure my own portfolio." I reached back into my uniform jacket and pulled out a second folded document. This one was much shorter, printed on standard white paper. I held it out. Trent did not reach for it, so I simply let it drop from my hand. It fluttered through the tense air and landed squarely on the expensive Persian rug at his feet. That is a formal 60-day eviction notice, I explained, my voice cutting through the room with absolute surgical precision. Since Vanguard Aerospace just terminated their lead project manager and suspended their senior floor supervisor, I highly doubt you will be able to maintain your monthly rental payments. I am not destroying the family, Mom. I am just liquidating a bad investment. You have exactly 2 months to pack your belongings and vacate my property. I am putting the house on the market. The silence that followed was so profound it felt as though the air pressure in the room had completely dropped. The fortress of expectations they had built, the massive pedestal they had placed Trent upon, the entire hierarchy of their toxic family dynamic, completely crumbled to dust right in front of my eyes. Jasmine broke first. Broke. The reality of losing her childhood home, on top of losing her country club and her husband's career, was simply too much for her fragile, superficial mind to process. She let out a piercing, gut-wrenching sob and literally dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor. She grabbed the fabric of my uniform trousers, her manicured fingernails digging desperately into the dark blue wool. "Simone, please." Jasmine begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Please do not do this. I am so sorry. I am so sorry I yelled at you. Trent was wrong. He was so wrong about everything. We will pay you back. I will get a job. Just please do not throw us out on the street. I have nowhere to go. We are your family, Simone. Please." I looked down at the golden child groveling at my feet. There was a time many years ago when seeing my sister cry would have broken my heart. I would have moved mountains to fix her problems just to earn a fleeting smile of approval. But that version of Simone was long dead. Before I could ask Jasmine to release my uniform, the front door slowly creaked open behind me. I turned my head slightly. My father Richard stood in the doorway. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. His shoulders were slumped, his tie was pulled loose, and his face carried the hollow, defeated expression of a man who had lost absolutely everything. He had clearly taken a taxi home after Vanguard security escorted him off the premises. He looked at Jasmine sobbing on the floor. He looked at the eviction notice resting on the rug. And finally he looked up at me. His eyes were red and completely filled with desperate regret. "Sweetheart," my father whispered, his voice cracking pathetically. "Simone, sweetheart, please let us sit down and talk about this. I made a mistake. I was blind. I let Trent manipulate me. I am your father. You cannot just abandon us like this." I stepped backward, pulling my leg away from Jasmine's desperate grip. She collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands and weeping loudly into the floorboards. Trent remained completely speechless, entirely frozen by the realization that he was the architect of his own absolute destruction. He had nothing left to say, no corporate buzzwords, no arrogant threats, just complete devastating silence. I turned my back on all of them. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer them a single word of closure or comfort. They had demanded my money, they had demanded my submission, and they had demanded my loyalty. They received exactly what they deserved. I walked out the front door, stepping over the threshold for the very last time. The cool afternoon air hit my face instantly, washing away the toxic stench of that house. I walked down the paved driveway and climbed into the spacious back seat of my waiting armored SUV. "Take me home," I told my driver. As the heavy vehicle pulled away from the curb, the muffled sounds of Jasmine's screaming and my mother's frantic sobbing faded into nothingness. I leaned back against the premium leather seat, closing my eyes. I took a slow, deep breath, and for the first time in 35 years, I felt the massive, suffocating weight of my family completely lift off my shoulders. I was entirely free. 1 year later, the landscape of my life looked remarkably different. The toxic debris of my past had been entirely swept away. I sold the suburban colonial house for a massive profit, completely severing my financial ties to my parents. The harsh reality of the private sector hit them exactly as hard as they deserved. Without the house and without Trent's inflated salary, the facade completely vanished. Jasmine and Trent filed for a bitter divorce just 4 months after the eviction. When the money dried up, the love dried up immediately with it. Trent is currently fighting massive federal fraud charges while working as a low-level data entry clerk. Jasmine was forced to move into a cramped two-bedroom apartment with my parents. Richard lost his pension completely and now works the night shift as a security guard at a local warehouse. My mother Brenda spends her days bitterly complaining to anyone who will listen about how her ungrateful daughter abandoned them, but her audience has dwindled to absolutely no one. I never spoke to them again. I stood on the sun-baked tarmac of an Air Force base, the heavy smell of jet fuel and hot asphalt filling the air. A massive fleet of next-generation fighter jets roared overhead, tearing through the bright blue sky in perfect, flawless formation. I shielded my eyes from the glare watching them execute a high-speed tactical turn. The silver star pinned perfectly to the collar of my uniform caught the sunlight. I was no longer a colonel. I had just been promoted to brigadier general, and the $500 million defense acquisitions budget was firmly, completely, and securely under my command. I turned away from the runway, looking directly into the camera, offering a calm, peaceful smile. They always tell you that blood is thicker than water. I said, my voice steady and completely fulfilled. But the actual ancient quote says that the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. It means the bonds you choose to make, the boundaries you choose to set, and the respect you demand are infinitely stronger than the family you simply happen to be born into. I adjusted the edge of my uniform jacket, standing perfectly tall. Have you ever had to pull the plug on relatives who only loved what they could extract from you? Have you ever had to walk away from people who demanded your loyalty but constantly disrespected your worth? Let me know your story in the comments below. And remember, never let anyone dictate your rank in life until they have seen your uniform. Stay strong, stay independent, and never apologize for protecting your peace.